Welcome. Thanks for joining us. We are speaking with Roger Quan, who is the Director of Air Quality and Climate Change at Metro Vancouver.
Hi, Jane. How are you?
Good, thanks. Thanks for joining us, Roger.
Thanks for having me.
First question, if you could share an example of a recent air quality management success story in your community and tell us what made it a success.
Okay, the example I'd probably give is our non-road diesel engine regulation, which we adopted actually in 2014. It is a regulation that addresses emissions of diesel particulate matter from non-road diesel engines. What made it a success is the science that was behind it. So previously Metro Vancouver had done some assessments of which of the air pollutants that are emitted in our airshed are causing the most harm in terms of human health risk. So diesel particulate matter through these scientific assessments was found to contribute about 2/3 of the lifetime cancer risk from exposure to air pollution in the Metro Vancouver region. So having a solid science evidence basis for it really did provide a good rationale for the regulation. So the regulation has been introduced in phases. We did a lot of consultation on it. It's being rolled out, looking at progressively older vintages of engines, or sorry, the reverse of progressively older. So the oldest engines are what we call Tier 0, and those actually have no emission standard whatsoever. And then slightly newer engines are Tier 1. So our regulation looks at Tier 0 and Tier 1 engines, requires them to register with Metro Vancouver. They actually pay a fee based on the amount of emissions that they generate. So there is an incentive based on that fee system to either remove that engine from service or retrofit it to a cleaner standard. So that's been a very successful intervention. It's really resulted in reductions in diesel particulate matter, which is very harmful, and these engines are operating really, really close to where people live, work, and play. So for that reason alone, we want to make sure that we're cleaning up this source from neighborhoods in Metro Vancouver.
Thanks for sharing that. Let's talk about climate change, which is a global problem, but there's a role for cities and provinces to play. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a role for cities and local governments to play. The Board of Directors of Metro Vancouver, in its board strategic plan for the years 2015 to 2018, has placed a really strong emphasis on climate action. They've directed us as staff to incorporate climate change mitigation and adaptation basically into everything Metro Vancouver does, and also directed us to develop a climate action strategy. We're currently working on that in the year 2018. We expect to have a draft of that in front of our Board of Directors towards the middle part of the year. And it's going to focus on all aspects of climate change. By that I mean mitigation, in other words, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Our board has adopted a goal of reducing from 2007 levels 80% of the greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2050. That's part of the reason we're calling the strategy the Climate 2050 strategy. But also adaptation is another one. There are some inevitable impacts of climate change that we expect to see. Those impacts will affect assets and infrastructure in Metro Vancouver. For example, if we see extreme weather events, we may see air quality impacts like wildfires, which we saw a lot of in the summers of 2015 and 2017. And we may also see, additional storm flows, storm surge, which impacts on some of the other services that Metro Vancouver operates, like sewage and drainage and wastewater treatment. And also, if we see less snowpack in the future years because of climate change, there's going to be less drinking water supply. So we did actually see in 2015 a very drought-impacted summer. So the response for local governments, and Metro Vancouver is trying to look at mitigation and adaptation. I think the reality is, on the mitigation side, even if Metro Vancouver met its 80% reduction target, our emissions pale in comparison to the global amounts of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases, but we do need to show leadership there and hopefully influence others. The real response from local governments is going to be on the adaptation side. If there is some degree of climate change, and we know there will be, how do we prepare for those impacts and make sure that our region is resilient to those impacts?
Good, thank you. Can you talk about ways in which public health and air quality management have been integrated into this community?
Metro Vancouver has a very long-standing air quality management program. It goes back to the late 1970s. We've integrated public health considerations into everything we do in air quality management. Central to our air quality management program is an air quality management plan. So we're actually implementing our third air quality management plan. We've had plans in 1994, which was actually the first regional air quality management plan in the country. Followed that up with another plan in 2005 and then again in 2011. What feeds into the plan is what I like to refer to as a really strong evidence basis. So we have a very comprehensive system of air quality monitoring stations. We have 29 monitoring stations from Horseshoe Bay to Hope that keep tabs on the air quality outdoors and reports that to the public so people are aware of what sorts of air pollution levels they're being exposed to. And we're increasingly putting health-related contaminants into that measurement of outdoor air quality. For example, when I spoke of the diesel regulation earlier, we are monitoring black carbon, which is an indicator of the amount of diesel particulate in the atmosphere. Our second tool is something called an emission inventory. We do those every 5 years. What we do there is we track all of the sources of pollution in the airshed, whether that's an industrial stack, a vehicle tailpipe, a residential chimney. It gives us a sense of what's contributing to air quality problems in the airshed, and it gives us a way of prioritizing which sources are needing additional intervention or more actions. And there is health considerations as well in our emission inventory. We're not just monitoring, we're not just assessing the common air contaminants, we're looking at those that have a health impact. So increasingly, health considerations are being integrated into the existing toolkit that we have for air quality management.
Okay, thank you. Let's talk about citizen science. How do you see the role of citizen science evolving in air management?
Citizen science is really interesting for, I think, all air quality agencies in the world. It's been quite a topic of conversation at the Air Quality and Health Workshop today. Citizen science basically in terms of air quality is new monitors that are available to the public at fairly affordable prices and fairly portable and ready to install. And they actually, what I like to call crowdsource, they take data from these monitors and they put it on a website that, all the users of the monitors are able to upload their data to something where everybody can see very local air quality measurement. There is the potential for these to be used inappropriately. We see examples of where somebody's looking at a 1 minute spike in concentration of particulate matter and comparing that inappropriately to the air quality standard for particulate matter, which is actually based on a 24-hour rolling average. So recognition that air quality levels can change quite rapidly over the course of a minute to an hour to 24 hours. So we do need to make sure that we're making the appropriate comparisons. There's also the issue that these instruments, they're subject to influences under different climatic conditions. We're hearing that they don't respond as well in cold conditions or that they may be affected by humidity. And the instruments that Metro Vancouver uses in its monitoring network are what we call federal reference methods. So there are standard methods and standard calibrations and audits that we do of our network monitoring stations. So ideally, we want government monitoring networks to be the go-to source for reliable information, but we do feel that there's a really strong role for citizen science to supplement those government networks. We can't have monitoring networks every block of every city. So citizen science can really help to fill in those gaps. But we're working with citizens we're doing a project where we're going to have a co-location of citizen science monitors with Metro Vancouver network station instruments, so we can get a better idea of the comparability, or at least if there's a systematic difference between citizen science and our government reference monitors. And we want to involve the public in that because what better credibility for the assessment than having the citizens be involved in it as well. Ultimately, what we hope to prepare is like a citizen's guide to citizen science so that we can really understand the limitations of these monitors, but also find the appropriate role for them in air quality monitoring networks.
Yeah, I imagine it was quite a topic amongst you in the workshop today.
Yeah.
We've been discussing that with our interviewees as well. what are some of the biggest air quality management challenges for your community right now and in the coming decade, and what new tools or approaches will be needed to address those challenges?
So I would talk about 3 challenges probably, or maybe it's 2. I'll talk about right now, first of all. It's the population density in Metro Vancouver. We're home to more than half the population of the province of BC, but only less than 0.5% of the land mass. So we really have a lot of people packed into a comparatively small area. So what that means is any emission source has the tendency to impact on a lot more lungs, a lot more people than you might find in the rural areas. And so I guess the response to that is to really evolve our program so that we're looking at local air quality management. We've tended to look at the region as a whole in terms of the standards that are set. We need to do more monitoring, more assessment, more interventions, if you will, at the very neighborhood scale. One example of that is a new regulatory proposal that we have forward for dealing with residential wood burning, in other words, fireplaces and wood stoves. These are impacting on people at the neighborhood level. We've had historically an exchange program where we provide some funding for people to change out an existing fireplace for something, or older model wood stove for something that is cleaner. But that is, only having limited impact. We've had about 500 exchanges since, I believe, 2009. That's 500 improvements in 500 neighborhoods, but nevertheless, we think that there's probably 100,000 of these devices out there, so we need to, we believe that it's time to add a regulatory component to that. So we see that quite often with our initiatives. We may start with something that's an education-based approach, but then move to a regulation or a regulatory approach when the results are not moving along as quickly as we'd like to see, or that we believe that there are health impacts occurring right now. The second big challenge that I would speak of is climate change, which I mentioned earlier. Climate change and its impacts on the region are being seen in the summers of 2015, 2017. 2 of the last 3 summers, we've seen direct climate change impacts on air quality, with wildfires that originated outside of the region, but smoke being blown into our airshed. In 2017, we had an unprecedented number of air quality advisories. These are basically warnings to the public when we feel that there are unhealthy air quality levels. We were under advisory in the summer of 2017 for 19 days and over 5 separate advisories. Typically, we might see 1 advisory each summer. And so this is a concern for us. If climate change and wildfire impacts are the new normal, then obviously our air quality programs have to respond to that. I think our response now is getting really good data to the public so that there is awareness of what the levels are when there are wildfire impacts, but also to make sure that we're not adding to that mix locally, that there are no local sources of fires in our watersheds or other forested areas in Metro Vancouver, or perhaps local sources like industrial sources, or getting people to even reduce the amount of vehicle traffic when we're already under an advisory. But climate change impact on us in many more ways than that. As I mentioned earlier, it's going to impact on our provision of utility services like drinking water, sewage and drainage and wastewater treatment and so on. So it really is what I call the challenge of the century, and it's something that is a very high priority for our board of directors, is to develop this climate action strategy to develop the local response.
Okay, good information.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Roger, for joining us today.
Thank you.